Tonight at 10, the world looks on as America's polling stations prepare to close in the stormy contest for the US presidency. Donald Trump, seeking a second term, has struggled to defend his record on fighting the pandemic.
You know, winning is easy. Losing is never easy. Not for me, it's not.
The Democratic challenger, Joe Biden, who's 77, has been taunted for months that he doesn't have the energy for the job.
It ain't over till it's over, and when it's over, we're going to win Pennsylvania because of you.
We'll be reporting from the key battleground states, including Pennsylvania, where the race for the White House will be settled.
This is a state Donald Trump barely won in 2016 by less than 1%. Joe Biden is feeling confident, but it could all depend on turnout.
And we'll be live in Washington with the latest on the mood in the rival camps as the voters' verdict is awaited.
Among the politicians, there is apprehension. Among the voters, there is trepidation over what comes next, whoever wins, whoever loses.
We'll have all the news and the latest pointers after a campaign that's been overshadowed by the impact of the pandemic. Also tonight, following last night's terror attack in Vienna when 4 people were shot dead, the UK's terror threat level is raised to severe. And as lockdown approaches in England, coaches and parents say the decision to stop grassroots sports will damage physical and mental health.
And later in the hour, we'll have Sports Day on the BBC News channel with all the latest reports, results, interviews and features from the BBC Sports Centre.
Good evening. In 2 hours' time, polling stations on the east coast of the United States will start to close, marking the end of the most divisive presidential campaign of modern times. The Republican candidate, President Donald Trump, and his Democratic challenger, Joe Biden, know that 100 million people have already taken part in early voting, breaking all records, and the high turnout reflecting the intensity of the debate about America's future. We have reports from the campaigns and from some of the key battlegrounds. In Florida, for example, which the experts say Donald Trump must win if he's to get a second term. In Pennsylvania, taken by Mr. Trump by a whisker 4 years ago, but at the top of the list of Democratic targets. In Delaware, which is Joe Biden's home state, where he'll be watching the nationwide results unfold. And in Washington, where Mr. Trump is waiting for the outcome of America's voters after a turbulent first term which has been overshadowed by the effects of coronavirus. And that is where we start tonight in the nation's capital. So let's join our North America editor there, John Sopel.
Hugh, thank you very much. Yes, if you are a lover of democracy, surely it is a cause for celebration that so many people have gone out to vote, that turnout will be at a record high, and people have queued for hours. But there is also nervousness, anxiety, trepidation about what happens next. The White House has been reinforced. There are shops and offices boarded up, workers told not to come to work tomorrow for fear of social unrest. Let's hope that doesn't come to pass. In the meantime, the two campaigns are straining every sinew to get every last vote. A pandemic, a president hospitalised in the midst of the campaign, racial unrest, an economic shutdown, billions of dollars spent by the two candidates, and now, today, finally, the sun is rising on polling day. America's exhausting, seemingly endless election has reached its climax. Unprecedented numbers. Over 100 million voted early, but big numbers are turning out today as well.
Voted for the greatest president in history, Donald J. Trump.
Trump is doing nothing for us.
He's going down today.
Young man, there's no need to feel down.
At his marathon of rallies yesterday, Donald Trump was firing on all cylinders.
Only in Pennsylvania. You know, we win Pennsylvania, we win the whole deal. You know that, right?
But today at Republican Party headquarters, it was a weary-sounding and more downbeat president as he contemplated the day and night ahead.
No, I'm not thinking about concession speech or acceptance speech yet. Hopefully, we'll be only doing one of those two. And, you know, winning is easy. Losing is never easy. Not for me, it's not.
Joe Biden was also in Pennsylvania today, returning to his childhood home of Scranton. He took his megaphone all over the state. Make no mistake, Pennsylvania is absolutely key to this election.
And by the way, folks, if you haven't gotten everybody out, get them out. It ain't over till it's over, and when it's over, we're going to win Pennsylvania because of you.
A quirky tradition of US elections is that the first place to vote is the small village of Dixville Notch in the mountains of New Hampshire. At midnight, the polling station opened. It closed a few minutes later.
All in favor? Aye. Polls are closed. I need to count.
I'm a lifelong Republican, voting for Joe Biden for president.
And that, in a nutshell, will decide this election. How many people feel like that?
Well, one could put one here, one could put one here.
In the oldest political slogan in the book, is it time for a change or 4 more years? But divided America is bracing for unrest, whether here in the nation's capital, the shishi shops of Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills, or the financial centre of New York. This is a nation that's not at ease with itself. John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
At 77, Joe Biden, if he wins, will become, by some margin, the oldest man to be elected President of the United States. Donald Trump, who's now 74, has sought to portray Mr. Biden as someone who is unfit, too old and too tired, in effect, to occupy the Oval Office. But within hours, the world will get the first indications of America's choice. Our North America correspondent, Nick Bryant, is with the Biden camp in Delaware, and he joins us now. Nick?
Hugh, I've just been speaking to one of Joe Biden's most senior advisors, and they are so confident and making no attempt to conceal their confidence. They're talking about winning states like Georgia. No Democrat has won Georgia since 1992. They think they stand a chance in Texas. Jimmy Carter was the last Democrat to win Texas in 1976. Now, 4 years ago, Donald Trump won, partly by portraying himself as the anti-Obama and the anti-Hillary Clinton. Joe Biden has become such a natural anti-Donald Trump. And his campaign has sought to emphasize the differences, what they see as the empathy against ego, the civility against ceaseless confrontation. His genial personality, they reckon, has helped. He's hard to demonize, he's hard to betray as a hate figure. And also this personal story of grief finds an echo in these sorrowful times. They think they have got this. They think they're going to win this COVID election.
Nick, many thanks. Nick Bryant there with some thoughts on the Biden camp in Delaware tonight. So before any results come in, let's recap briefly on the way that a US president is elected and when, in fact, we're likely to get a result. The crucial thing to remember is that a candidate can win a majority of the votes nationwide, as Hillary Clinton did in 2016, and still go on to lose the election. Now, that is because the US Constitution established what's called an electoral college to determine the overall result. Now, to become president, a candidate must win at least 270 votes in the electoral college. Each of the 50 states is allocated a number of electoral college votes based mainly on population size, and these are allocated to one of the candidates. Now, the state with the biggest population, that's California, has 55 votes in the Electoral College and always tends to back the Democratic candidate in these elections, while a state such as Tennessee, with a smaller population and only 11 Electoral College votes, well, that tends to vote Republican. Now, all of that means that the outcome does depend heavily on the so-called swing states. They're marked here in purple, several of them, and one of the biggest battlegrounds is the state of Pennsylvania, with 20 votes in the Electoral College. And that's where we join my colleague Clive Myrie, who's in Philadelphia for us with the latest tonight.
Yes, Hugh, if you look at the electoral map, it's pretty clear that most of the roads to victory for Joe Biden and Donald Trump, they run through the streets of Pennsylvania. So this is going to be a keenly watched state this evening, not least by the lawyers. The problem is, with 2.5 million absentee ballots still left to be counted, and many counties are not going to start doing that for another day, then it could be some time before either candidate finds out whether or not they've actually won. America is unnerved, but energized. The mining of votes by the campaigns is now over on this election day. And Norb Dotzel, who helps run a family quarry business in rural Pennsylvania, is adamant his voice will be heard. He'll vote in person. He doesn't want to risk a mail-in ballot, despite coronavirus.
Good, good.
Bottom line is you just don't trust it.
I don't trust him. No, I don't trust him. No. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist or anything like that. I just want to know, I'm going to go do it the way I always did it. I'm just going to go do it the way I always did it. You know, they have all these safety protocols in place, 6 feet, wear the mask, all that stuff. So, you know, if they're so sure that that works, why shouldn't I be sure it works?
Studies show Republicans are more likely to vote in person than Democrats, whose worries about COVID-19 have seen an extraordinary rise in mail-in votes.
Your voice matters, and it will only be heard if you vote.
Whatever the method, the exhortation for voters to do their duty has been heard loud and clear in an election that pits two very different ideas of what a future America should look like.
Do something about everything.
But for some, despite the enthusiasm, there is a darkness over this exercise of democracy, with threats of lawsuits to try to invalidate the votes of many.
Hi, Jacqueline.
Hi, Jacqueline Victor is 23 and voted by mail in Pennsylvania last week. A Democrat, she believes Donald Trump in suggesting without any evidence that postal ballots are susceptible to wide-scale fraud is trying to steal the election.
I think he wants his people to turn out in big numbers, and he's afraid of people like me, of younger people, you know, voting, or maybe people who weren't able to get to the polls on election day. He wants to delegitimize those people, and I do think he is trying to take away people's voice.
Charlie, yeah, we don't.
Norb Dotzel and his 84-year-old father make their way to the polls.
Yeah.
Like millions of others today, in what is a sign of America's democratic strength. But lawyers on both sides are watching closely, especially in crucial swing states like this, a sign that weakness might also lurk at the heart of the American idea. Clive Myrie, BBC News in Pennsylvania.
Just to pick up on that theme of postal votes, because they do typically take longer to count. They have to go through a verification process, checking signatures and addresses. But some states, such as Florida, allow this process to start weeks before Election Day, which means we might get a result from that key state relatively early on. Our correspondent, Nomia Iqbal, is in Miami with the latest on the situation there.
Yes, Hugh, more than 9 million people have already voted here in Florida. More people are still voting for at least the next couple of hours when the last polling station will close. Melania Trump, the First Lady, voted this morning. And as you mentioned there, the ballots are already being counted because of the way Florida's election laws work, which means that we are likely to get an early sense of how this presidential race will shape up. This will be a tight race. It always is. This is such a crucial swing state because it has the most electoral college votes. And President Trump has a mansion here. He votes here. And unless he wants to retire here in January, he needs the 29 electoral college votes that Florida has to offer. It's more straightforward for Joe Biden. If he flips the state blue this evening, then it's more or less guaranteed that he will have the keys to the White House.
Nomia, many thanks once again. The latest there in Miami in Florida, our correspondent Nomia Iqbal. We'll have more on the election before the end of the programme. And don't forget our US election special programme starting at 11:30 p.m. Here on BBC One, on the BBC News channel and on the iPlayer. And there will also be results coverage, of course, on BBC Radio. Now, in Vienna, 14 people have been arrested in connection with last night's gun attacks in the city. 4 people were killed in the shootings, another 22 were injured when a gunman described as an Islamist terrorist by the authorities there fired into crowds of people at 6 different locations. The attack took place in the city centre, where people were enjoying a last night out in restaurants and cafes before a coronavirus lockdown comes into force. Our correspondent Jenny Hill is in Vienna with the latest for us.
Yes, this city has for so long enjoyed a reputation as a safe place, immune apparently from the kind of Islamist terrorism that's torn through so many other European capitals. Last night, all that changed. Austria is now observing 3 days of national mourning following the attack which targeted the very heart of this city. Violence, confusion on the streets of Vienna. People fled as shots were fired and armed police raced to secure the city. It was the eve of a corona lockdown. Many had gathered for a last night out in a city with a reputation for safety.
Just heard shots everywhere, and the police, the helicopters were flying around us, and we got really afraid, so we decided to hide ourselves in the restaurant.
Caught on camera, a man thought to be the perpetrator. This rabbi told us he'd looked out of his window to see him shooting, apparently at random.
I saw the attacker with a long weapon, a rifle or a gun, running around, shooting at people, targeting people, sitting outside the bars and pubs, which are lined along the street.
Just days after terror attacks in France, another country mourns its dead. Among the victims, an elderly man and woman, a young passerby and a waitress. Others are in hospital, critically injured. The hunt for suspects continues. Detectives have made several arrests, but attention's focused on the 20-year-old gunman shot dead by police last night.
The shooter was born in Austria. He has a migration background from northern Macedonia, and he was in prison because he's a supporter of the Islamic State. But of course we will have to find out the details in the next days.
Vienna's streets quiet today. Fear and corona have brought the city centre to a near standstill. But Moritz, a doctor, told us he felt compelled to do something.
It's really hard to show that you're grieving, because nobody should be outside. And I want to grieve, I want to show sympathy.
As you'd expect, there's shock here, there's disbelief, but there's also a sense of resignation. This has become a depressingly familiar scenario for Europe. A city centre, streets which felt safe, transformed in a matter of minutes. The question for Austria now is this: will last night's attack change the country? And if so, how? For now, though, a quiet defiance. Last night, as violence raged outside, members of the city's Philharmonic Orchestra were trapped in their concert hall. They chose, quite simply, to play on. Jenny Hill, BBC News, Vienna.
Well, in response to the attacks in Europe, both in Austria and in France, the Home Secretary here has raised the United Kingdom terror threat level from substantial to severe. So the UK is now on the second highest threat level, and an attack is judged to be highly likely. The Minister said that people should be alert but not alarmed. Our security correspondent Frank Gardner is with me. Frank, let's explain to viewers what's behind this change of level.
Sure. Well, pretty much from the moment this attack started to unfold last night, JTAC, that's the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre that sits inside MI5 headquarters but separate from them, started to examine what that would mean for the safety of British nationals both here and abroad. And they looked at the pattern of attacks that we've seen in Europe in the last few weeks. 3 deadly jihadist attacks in France, followed by what's called a marauding terrorist firearms attack in Vienna last night. A gunman walking around heavily armed, picking people off. And they concluded that that was enough to push the threat level up from where it had been, substantial, meaning an attack was likely, to severe, highly likely. Now, in practice, we're not going to notice a great deal of difference. Remember as well that we're about to go into lockdown, which is going to make it much harder for anybody planning a terrorist attack, should they be so, and there's no indication at the moment that anybody is. It makes it harder for them to execute it. What it does mean, though, is that an awful lot of people are going to be online communicating, plotting, planning and possibly fantasizing. There are still more than 3,000 subjects of interest that MI5 and the police are following with suspected terrorist sympathies in this country.
Frank, many thanks again. Frank Gardner, our security correspondent there. Let's have a look at the latest official government figures, which show that there have been 20,080 new coronavirus infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period, and 397 deaths were reported. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. It takes the total number of deaths so far across the UK to 47,250. The Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, and the Chief Medical Officer for England, Professor Chris Whitty, have both been challenged by MPs about the evidence behind the latest lockdown in England. In particular, they were asked about some modelling scenarios which had suggested there could be as many as 4,000 deaths a day without appropriate measures in place. One MP accused them of frightening a lot of people. But Sir Patrick said it was based on an assumption to try to get a reasonable worst-case scenario. Our science editor David Shuckman has more details.
It's the risk of the health service being overwhelmed that suddenly changed government policy. A decision based on scientific projections for how many thousands the virus might kill in the coming months. But looking at this official graph, what are the real chances of the worst scenario being right?
As the Chief Scientific Advisor to...
That's the question that MPs raised today, putting the government's top advisors on the spot.
You don't think that you just frightened people who do not have your scientific background and understanding of models and not...
Well, I hope not. I mean, I hope not, and that's certainly not the aim. It's very difficult to project forward in a way that doesn't inevitably lead to a problem of, is that real? No, it's not real. It's a model, but it is what we need to understand, because this is a disease which is spreading, like all epidemics, in a way that will affect us in weeks to come, but isn't felt today.
Some of the projections for future deaths were made before the regional three-tier system had any effect. And like any computer models, they're meant to be a guide to what might happen rather than a firm prediction. So is there a clear sense of the impact of the virus? Today we got the latest figures for what are called excess deaths. That's deaths above average, shown on this line here, based on data over the last 5 years. Back in April, losses were massively above that average line, and nearly all of them were because of COVID-19. And looking more recently, there are signs of another increase in deaths above average, and the main cause is COVID. The number of hospital admissions is the key indicator of what's happening right now. And whatever the arguments over future scenarios, there's a warning that things are mostly going the wrong way.
The rates are still steadily tracking up in all the data that I have seen in the older age groups, who are the ones who are likely to translate into hospitalisations, ICU cases and deaths.
The reality is that, on average, someone who's infected is spreading the virus to more than one other person. And the hope is that the new restrictions will help to reverse that. David Shuckman, BBC News.
Everyone who lives or works in Liverpool will be offered a rapid coronavirus test, whether they have symptoms or not, from Friday. Military personnel will help to deliver the pilot scheme, and if it's successful, it could be rolled out across the United Kingdom. Our health correspondent Dominic Hughes reports from Liverpool.
But what did the wars do to people's faith?
Like so many others across the country, pupils at St Margaret's Academy in Liverpool are making up for time lost during the first lockdown.
The imagery tends to be a little bit more positive here.
The threat to their education from the coronavirus remains, especially from those who are asymptomatic, who don't yet have symptoms, but can still infect others.
It's hard for people to come out of work, out of school. We've been affected so badly already.
But what do these sixth formers think about the plan for citywide testing?
You've got to factor in all the people that don't want to get tested, because you can't force people to get tested.
People aren't being safe, especially in Liverpool. There's been a few cases where people just aren't sticking to isolation rules and stuff. So I think I can see it from that point of view why they want to do that.
People do live in fear about the coronavirus, and so it would settle a lot of people's minds if they knew a definite yes or no whether you've got it.
It's an opportunity to drive down the R rate.
The school's principal is Stephen Brierley.
I think if we've got good, accurate knowledge of who's got it and who hasn't, our schools will be safer because there'll be less asymptomatic people in school. There'll be fewer people who are infected, fewer people in schools who are infected, and therefore more children staying in school, more learning going on.
The Liverpool pilot will start this week. As well as existing swab tests, there will be what are known as lateral flow tests, which can provide a result within an hour without the need to use a lab. Organising citywide testing will be a logistical challenge. The Army will once again help, as it did during the first wave of the pandemic. The head of the Test and Trace programme in England, which has been criticised for having only a marginal impact on reducing infections, says this will be a team effort.
This is a programme led by Liverpool, for Liverpool. We together want to find as many people who have the disease as possible so that we can stop them infecting others, and that's the way we will all get back to work and get back to the lives we want to live.
Even a citywide testing programme won't be enough to stop COVID in its tracks. The basics, washing your hands, wearing a face covering, maintaining social distance, remain the best way to stop the spread of the virus. And there are big questions about how many people are going to want to self-isolate if they're not showing any symptoms, and how many will be willing to come forward for a test if it potentially means missing out on work and the pay that will bring.
Anytime you see fire in literature, you've got to think.
In a city that has seen some of the highest number of COVID cases in the UK, the big question is whether more testing will help slow or even reverse the spread of the virus and help keep places like St Margaret's free from infection. Dominic Hughes, BBC News, Liverpool.
The Wales football manager Ryan Giggs has denied allegations of assault after police were called to his home on Sunday evening. Giggs was arrested and bailed after an alleged row with his girlfriend, Kate Greville. The Welsh Football Association has announced that he will not be involved in the side's upcoming international training camp. 4 former police officers who were involved in the initial investigation into the murder of the black teenager Stephen Lawrence have been told that they could face criminal charges. The 18-year-old was stabbed to death in southeast London in 1993. The officers have been investigated over possible misconduct. By tomorrow night, all grassroots sports in England for both children outside school and adults will have to stop. Coaches, parents and campaigners say the decision could have a damaging effect on both physical and mental health. But ministers insist the restrictions are necessary to prevent the spread of coronavirus. Our sports editor Dan Rowan has the story.
Enjoying it while it lasts. Children making the most of Macclesfield's Moss Rose ground this week as the club opened its doors for training sessions before grassroots sport comes to a halt. Former Wales international Robbie Savage, who also coaches a local junior side, told me not giving youth sport an exemption is a mistake.
You know, I don't really understand it. For me, it's a huge part of their education, the mental health, the physical well-being of all these youngsters. For this to be taken away from them at this time is, for me, it can be so damaging.
The government says pausing sport will reduce transmission from mixing of households, but those involved insist there's minimal risk and want to play on.
We do it to play with our team, we make new friends, it's just an amazing part of our life, and if it goes, everyone's going to be really upset.
Scenes like this are about to be put on hold on grassroots pitches throughout England for the next month at least, and the fear is that the suspension of youth sport will have a damaging impact on youngsters' physical and mental health at a time when the amount of PE and sport in schools has been reduced because of the pandemic. Despite some confusion within government, today it was confirmed even non-contact sports, golf and tennis will stop. Barbara Rosen's been a member at this course for the last 46 years.
I feel very sad because it keeps me going. I have a sick husband and this is a way of getting out. And this is all going to stop, and it's sad because we're all going to be locked indoors once again.
Indoor sports and gyms will also close. Maria Parker Harris found swimming helped her mental health after long-term fertility treatment. She's now a mother and believes passionately in the benefits of being in the pool.
Everybody says how important health and weight is to fighting COVID, and where better to do that and to deal with the oncoming mental health epidemic than in gyms and swimming pools, which are COVID safe.
Ministers say exemptions risk undermining the rules and people can have unlimited outdoor exercise for the next month, but stopping grassroots sport is proving controversial. Dan Rowan, BBC News.
Tributes have been paid today to the actor and comedian John Sessions, best known for his roles on the television shows Whose Line Is It Anyway?, Spitting Image and QI. He's died at the age of 67. He died yesterday at his home in South London from a heart condition. Rory Bremner, his friend, said he was simply the best. He called him a man of brilliance. Well, before we go tonight, an update on the main story for us, and that's the US presidential election, of course, with polling stations starting to close in under 2 hours' time. Let's return to our North America editor, John Sopel in Washington. John, you've been following every day of this campaign, indeed the full presidency of Donald Trump. What about your sense tonight? We heard from Nick earlier that the Biden camp sounded quite confident. What's your sense of the Trump camp?
Hugh, I think it is matched by a nervousness. I think there is an unease about the way things are going. If you think of it in terms of maybe 6, 7, 8 states will decide this election, Donald Trump has to more or less win everywhere. And so they're feeling OK about Florida. Apparently that is kind of on a knife edge, what happens there. But then Donald Trump has to win in North Carolina. He has to win in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. And if he starts to lose any of those states, then he loses the presidency. Just a word if you're thinking of staying up all night and kind of do what will I get the result. If Donald Trump has lost, we should learn it tonight. If he's won, it will probably take a few days to find out, because those upper Midwestern states aren't going to declare for 3 or 4 days. Whereas if Joe Biden wins in Florida or Texas or Ohio, which we should learn tonight, then that is more or less game over for Donald Trump. But as you know, Hugh, any election night is nerve-wracking. You're waiting to see real data, and that is something we don't have at the moment.
John, it's fascinating. We'll talk to you again tomorrow. Of course we will. But for tonight, thanks very much, John, there, of course, and the team in the States, and the special programme for the results starting at 11:30 p.m. here on BBC One. It should be a rather exciting night. But now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.